June, 1945. Okinawa. The air inside the Himeyuri cave tunnels is a thick, stagnant soup of humidity, gangrene, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Deep beneath the limestone ridges of the island, the silence is not a reprieve, but a heavy, suffocating weight. It is broken only by the rhythmic dripping of groundwater against the jagged stone floors and the shallow, ragged breathing of the wounded. There is no sunlight here, only the flickering, sickly yellow glow of oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the damp walls. For the young women of the Himeyuri Student Corps, time has ceased to be measured by clocks. It is measured by the arrival of the next stretcher and the deepening of the tremors in the earth above. The world outside is a cacophony of steel. The typhoon of steel, as the locals call it, has been screaming for months, a relentless bombardment that has pulverized the surface into a lunar wasteland. But inside the darkness of the caves, the terror is more intimate. The young nurses, some no older than 15 or 16, move like ghosts through the gloom. Their uniforms are tattered, stained with the soil of a homeland that is being torn apart. They have been taught that the defense of this island is a sacred duty, a final stand for the emperor, and that the monsters approaching from the shoreline are not men, but demons, beings who know no mercy and who find sport in the desecration of the innocent. Every vibration in the cave ceiling, every distant muffled explosion, signals the closing of a trap. The Japanese command has made the stakes clear. Capture is a fate worse than death. To fall into the hands of the Americans is to invite a slow, agonizing end characterized by humiliation and unimaginable cruelty. In the pockets of their stained aprons, many of these girls carry a final gift from their superiors, a small ceramic hand grenade. It is a heavy, cold weight, a silent promise that when the demons finally breach the darkness, there is a way to maintain their honor. They are prepared to become dust, to vanish into the limestone before they are touched by the hands of the enemy. The smell of the cave is the smell of a dying empire. It is the scent of rotting rice, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, chemical odor of primitive antiseptics that have long since run dry. The nurses work in a trance, tending to soldiers whose limbs have been shattered by shrapnel and whose eyes are glazed with the hollow stare of the doomed. There is no talk of victory here, only the grim endurance of the inevitable. Outside, the tropical rain falls, turning the battlefield into a slurry of mud and bone, but inside the Himeyuri, the only moisture is the cold sweat on the foreheads of girls who are waiting for the sound of a voice that does not speak their tongue. Then, the sound changes. The distant thunder of the naval guns is replaced by something closer, something sharper, the rhythmic crunch of combat boots on gravel and the metallic clatter of equipment. It is the sound of the surface world descending into the depths. The oil lamps flicker and die as a sudden rush of fresh, cool air is pushed into the tunnel by a distant breach. The nurses freeze. The grenades are gripped tightly, fingers trembling against the pins. This is the moment they were born for, the moment they were told would be their last. The demons have arrived at the mouth of the cave, and the darkness is about to be illuminated by the fire of 1,000 lies. To understand the terror held by these young women, one must look back to the years of rigorous preparation that preceded the firestorm of Okinawa. The Himeyuri Student Corps was not a military unit in the traditional sense, but a mobilization of the island's brightest pupils, daughters of farmers, teachers, and merchants. Since the mid-1930s, the Japanese educational system had shifted its focus from the humanities to a rigid, militaristic nationalism. These girls grew up under the shadow of the imperial rescript on education, a doctrine that placed the emperor at the center of the universe and taught that the ultimate virtue was to die beautifully for the Kokutai, the national body. By the time the American fleet appeared on the horizon, the nurses had been conditioned to believe that surrender was a physical impossibility, an act so shameful it would sever them from their families and their history forever. The historical reality of 1945 was one of desperate propaganda. As the Japanese military suffered successive defeats across the Pacific, the rhetoric within Okinawa reached a fever pitch. The Great East Asia War was depicted as a spiritual struggle against Western materialism. The girls were told that the Americans were a race of savages who had no concept of honor or mercy. Flyers and radio broadcasts warned them that captured women would be subjected to horrific mutilations or worse. This psychological fortification was so effective that it created a collective psychosis. The nurses were not just medical assistants. They were the final guardians of a vanishing world. Their role in the cave hospitals was seen as a sacred sacrifice, a way to participate in the Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, where an entire population would rather perish than face the perceived indignity of a foreign occupation. The significance of this moment lies in the collision of these two vastly different worlds. On one side was the industrial, democratic machine of the United States, fueled by a logistical abundance that the world had never seen. On the other was a society pushed to the brink of extinction, clinging to a feudal code of Bushido that had been weaponized by a modern military state. For the nurses, the Americans were an abstract evil, a force of nature that brought only fire. They had seen the napalm bloom like orange flowers across the hills and heard the roar of the flamethrowers clearing the caves. In their minds, there was no middle ground. There was only the victory of the emperor or the silence of the grave. As the battle for Okinawa entered its final, bloodiest phase, the command structure of the Japanese defense began to disintegrate. The nurses were ordered to leave the safety of the deeper bunkers and move into the frontline caves, often directly in the path of the advancing U.S. Marines and Army infantry. This transition from student to combat medic happened overnight. They were forced to amputate limbs with hand saws and treat abdominal wounds with nothing but sea water and prayer. The reality of the war had stripped away the romanticism of the classroom, leaving only the raw, pulsating fear of the demons, who were now only a few meters of rock and earth away. The stage was set for an encounter that would either confirm their worst nightmares or shatter the very foundation of their reality. The silence in the cave was shattered by the sharp, authoritative bark of a loudspeaker, casting a booming voice in broken Japanese into the damp recesses of the tunnel. "Come out! We have food and medicine. You will not be harmed." To the nurses huddled in the back of the chamber, this was not a promise. It was a sinister trick, a classic maneuver of the American demons designed to lure them into a state of vulnerability before the slaughter began. One of the senior students, her hands trembling with a cold sweat that mirrored the walls of the cave, reached for the ceramic grenade tucked into her sash. She had seen the posters. She had heard the speeches. She knew that the only way to protect her virtue and the honor of her family was to become a fragment of the rock itself. At the entrance, the silhouette of a soldier appeared, backlit by the blinding, tropical Okinawan sun. He was a mountain of a man compared to the gaunt, starving girls inside. He wore a heavy steel helmet and carried an M1 Garand, his uniform a dusty olive drab that seemed to absorb the very light of the cave mouth. The nurses instinctively retreated, their backs pressing against the jagged limestone until the stone bit into their skin. They waited for the burst of gunfire, the searing heat of a flamethrower, or the rough hands of a captor. They had been told that American soldiers were monsters who kept the ears of their enemies as trophies. They expected a predatory glint in his eyes, a cruel smile as he realized he had cornered a group of defenseless women. Instead, the soldier stopped. He did not rush forward. He did not shout. He lowered his rifle, letting it hang by its sling, and raised his hands in a universal gesture of peace. Behind him, other figures appeared, but they too remained at a distance. The nurses watched, paralyzed by a terrifying confusion. Why was he waiting? Why was he not attacking? One girl, barely 16, gripped the pin of her grenade so tightly her knuckles turned a ghostly white. She looked at her companions, seeking the signal to end it altogether, to vanish in a singular bloom of fire and smoke. They had practiced this moment in their minds 1,000 times, rehearsing the final banzai that would echo through the darkness. But the violence they craved as a release did not come. The lead soldier took a single step forward, reaching into a pouch on his webbing. The nurses flinched, expecting him to draw a blade or a pistol. Instead, he pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in silver foil. He tossed it gently toward them. It skittered across the wet floor, coming to a rest near the feet of the youngest student. For several long seconds, no one moved. The object sat there, a shimmering anomaly in the filth of the cave. To the girls, it looked like a weapon, perhaps a new type of explosive they had not been warned about. They stared at the silver paper, waiting for the blast that would finally bring the darkness they had been taught to embrace as their only friend. The silver foil did not detonate. Instead, the American soldier reached for a heavy canvas canteen and stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. He unscrewed the cap and took a long, exaggerated drink, then held the vessel out toward the nurses. The scent of clean, filtered water, something they had not encountered in weeks, drifted through the stale air. One of the girls, her throat cracked and bleeding from dehydration, watched him with a mixture of terror and agonizing thirst. The dichotomy was staggering. The propaganda had promised a monster who would poison their wells, yet here was a man offering his own life-sustaining ration. The soldier beckoned them forward once more. When they remained frozen, he knelt in the mud, setting the canteen down on the floor and sliding it toward them. He then reached for a small, olive-drab medical kit fastened to his belt. The nurses braced themselves, their hands tightening on the grenades, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out rolls of clean white gauze and a tube of sulfa ointment. He pointed toward a nurse whose arm had been lacerated by falling stone during a previous bombardment. His eyes were not filled with the bloodlust they had been taught to expect. They were weary, rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much death and wished to see no more. Slowly, the youngest of the Himeyuri students released her grip on the ceramic pin. The tension in the cave began to shift, a fragile bridge of basic human need stretching across the abyss of wartime ideology. The American medic, sensing the thaw, motioned for his companions to stay back. He moved into the dim light of the oil lamps and began to work. With steady, gentle hands, he cleansed the girl's wound. The sting of the antiseptic was sharp, but it was followed by the soothing coolness of a professional dressing. The nurses watched in stunned silence. They had been prepared for the bayonet. They were entirely unprepared for the bandage. This first contact was a physical refutation of every lesson they had learned in the classrooms of Naha. The demons possessed tools of healing that were more advanced than anything the Japanese army had provided. The abundance of the American military machine was on full display, not in the form of artillery, but in the sheer quality of their mercy. They had clean bandages, endless water, and a strange, calm efficiency that spoke of a culture that valued the preservation of life, even the lives of the enemy. The nurses looked at one another, the heavy grenades in their pockets suddenly feeling like relics of a lie that was rapidly disintegrating in the presence of a simple canteen and a roll of gauze. As the Americans began to help the girls to their feet, the expected brutality remained absent. There were no shouts, no insults, and no violence. Instead, the soldiers formed a corridor of safety, guiding the starving, trembling women toward the mouth of the cave. For the first time in months, the nurses stepped out into the blinding light of day. The world outside was a charred ruin, but as they were led toward a waiting transport truck, they were met with a sight that defied logic. American GIs sitting on the bumpers of their jeeps, smoking and talking, watching the enemy pass not with hatred, but with a quiet, somber respect. The nightmare was ending, but the shock of their survival was only just beginning. The sun on the surface was a physical blow, a searing brilliance that forced the nurses to shield their eyes after months of subterranean gloom. As they stood trembling in the harsh light, the emotional contrast between their expectations and this burgeoning reality began to fracture their resolve. 4 years, the girls of the Himeyuri had lived within a carefully constructed mythos where the American soldier was the personification of chaos and cruelty. They expected to be shackled, to be mocked, or to be led to a place of execution. Their internal world was a landscape of shadows, populated by the terrifying caricatures drawn by imperial propagandists. Yet, as they scanned the clearing, they saw men who were undeniably human. These soldiers were dirty, their faces etched with the same soul-crushing weariness that the girls felt in their own bones. They were not the snarling beasts of the posters. They were boys from Iowa and New Jersey who looked at the nurses with a profound, quiet pity. One nurse, her mind racing to reconcile the two versions of reality, watched a young American private leaning against a charred palm tree. He wasn't sharpening a knife or preparing a cage. Instead, he was whistling a low, melancholic tune while cleaning the dirt from under his fingernails. This mundane display of normalcy was perhaps the most jarring shock of all. In the Japanese military culture they knew, the relationship between victor and vanquished was absolute and often brutal. To be defeated was to lose one's humanity. But these Americans seemed to operate on a different frequency, one that did not require the humiliation of the weak to affirm the strength of the powerful. The nurses found themselves in a state of cognitive dissonance so profound it was physically dizzying. Every step they took without being struck, every minute that passed without an assault, was a silent strike against the foundation of their entire education. The reflection in the eyes of the GIs was not one of conquest, but of shared relief that the killing had paused. The nurses realized, with a slow and painful clarity, that they had been lied to, not just about the enemy's character, but about the nature of the world itself. They had been told the Americans fought for greed and destruction, yet they saw soldiers sharing their own meager rations with Okinawan orphans nearby. They saw an abundance of spirit that mirrored the abundance of their steel. The heavy ceramic grenades still hidden in their rags began to feel not like instruments of honor, but like weights of a terrible deception. The emotional wall they had built to survive the siege was crumbling, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful uncertainty. They were no longer waiting to die. They were being forced to contemplate the much more difficult task of continuing to live in a world that was nothing like the one they had been promised. As the nurses were gathered into the shade of a makeshift collection point, the soldier who had first approached them in the cave reappeared. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, flat rectangle wrapped in brown paper and silver foil, the same object that had skittered across the cave floor moments earlier. This time he did not toss it. He peeled back the paper with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing a dark, rich substance. He broke off a square and ate it himself, showing them it was not a trick or a slow-acting poison. Then he held the remainder out to the lead nurse. Her fingers trembled as she took the piece of Hershey's chocolate. To a girl who had lived on handfuls of dry, weevil-infested rice and brackish water for months, the sight was surreal. She placed the fragment on her tongue. The explosion of flavor was more than just sweetness. It was the taste of an entire civilization. In the pre-war years, chocolate had been an expensive luxury in Japan, and during the war it had vanished entirely, replaced by the bitter grit of substitute grains. This single bar represented a logistical miracle. While Japanese soldiers were starving in their holes, the Americans had enough industrial capacity to provide their frontline troops with sweets. The chocolate was a symbol of an abundance so vast it felt like a weapon of its own, not one that destroyed, but one that overwhelmed the senses. It was a tangible piece of the world they had been told was failing, yet here it was, melting in the heat of an Okinawan afternoon. The other nurses watched her, their eyes wide and questioning. When she nodded, a silent signal that it was safe, the soldier distributed the rest. The act of sharing food is a primal human bond, and in that moment the ideological walls finally collapsed. The chocolate was the antithesis of the ceramic grenade. One was designed to end a life in a jagged burst of porcelain and fire. The other was designed for pleasure, for comfort, and for the simple joy of being alive. The nurses sat in the dust, savoring the richness, the dark velvet coating their mouths. It was the first time they had tasted anything other than fear in years. This simple gesture of giving something unnecessary, something purely for comfort, spoke louder than any surrender demand. It revealed a culture that had the luxury of mercy because it possessed the security of plenty. For the Himeyuri girls, the chocolate bar became a recurring symbol of their salvation. Every time they heard the crinkle of silver foil in the weeks to come, it would remind them that they were no longer in a world where death was the only honorable exit. The American demons were men who carried pieces of home in their pockets and were willing to share that home with the very people who had been prepared to kill them. The dark, sweet taste lingered long after the chocolate was gone, a permanent reminder that the humanity they had been taught to discard was the very thing that had saved them. The transport trucks eventually rattled into a sprawling American field hospital, a city of olive-drab canvas that had risen from the Okinawan mud like a miracle of engineering. For the Himeyuri nurses, the transition from fugitives to assistants was the final stage of their internal metamorphosis. They were ushered into the triage tents, expecting to be used as forced labor or kept in cages. Instead, they were handed clean aprons, soap, and hot water. The American medical officers, recognizing the girls' training, did not treat them as prisoners of war, but as colleagues in a desperate struggle against mortality. In the frantic heat of the tents, the ideology of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere evaporated, replaced by the universal language of medicine. The sight of the American medical supply chain was a revelation that defied their understanding of reality. In the Japanese caves, they had been forced to reuse bloody bandages and operate with rusted tools. Here, the Americans possessed an endless mountain of sterile supplies. There were rows of folding cots, portable X-ray machines powered by humming generators, and a constant flow of penicillin, a magic drug the Japanese military lacked. The nurses moved between the rows of wounded, their hands steadying as they realized that the American doctors were treating Japanese prisoners with the same meticulous care as their own GIs. This parity of treatment was the ultimate subversion of everything they had been taught about Western barbarism. As they began to assist in the wards, a profound psychological shift took hold. One nurse found herself holding the hand of a dying Japanese soldier while an American medic administered oxygen. In that shared moment of grief and effort, the distinction between demon and human vanished. They were no longer pawns in a divine war. They were simply people standing in the wreckage of a failed world, trying to salvage what remained. The nurses realized that their shared duty to save lives was a higher calling than the nationalistic death cult that had nearly claimed them. The American abundance was not just in their weapons or their chocolate, but in their capacity to provide care to those who had been prepared to kill them. By the end of the first week, the nurses were working in a rhythm of professional cooperation. They taught the Americans how to communicate with the Okinawan civilians, and in return, the Americans showed them how to use modern surgical equipment. This collaboration was a quiet, revolutionary act. Each bandage applied and each wound cleaned by the combined efforts of former enemies was a stitch in the fabric of a new, peaceful future. The transformation was complete. The girls who had entered the caves as instruments of war emerged from the hospital as agents of healing, their loyalty no longer bound to a dying emperor, but to the living, breathing humanity they saw in the eyes of their captors. The historical record of the Battle of Okinawa is often defined by the staggering loss of life, but within the specific sector of the Himeyuri nurses, a different narrative began to emerge, one of documented survival against all odds. As the Japanese 32nd Army collapsed, the military issued a final, desperate order on June 18 for the Student Corps to dissolve and fend for themselves. This was essentially a death sentence. The girls were cast out into a landscape where the U.S. 10th Army was unleashing a concentrated barrage of naval gunfire and close-quarters infantry assaults. Statistics from the era suggest that of the 222 students and 18 teachers in the Corps, over half perished, many through mass suicides in caves like the Third Buna Cave. Yet, for those who encountered the American line, the data shifted from casualties to survivors. The American military policy toward non-combatants on Okinawa was a stark departure from the scorched earth tactics the Japanese nurses had been conditioned to expect. Detailed logs from civil affairs units and military government teams reveal a massive logistical effort to provide for the civilian population. While the nurses had been told they were being hunted, the reality was that the Americans were setting up hundreds of refugee camps and mobile kitchens. Captured diaries from the survivors reflect a stunned disbelief at the sheer scale of the American commitment to their welfare. One nurse noted that while her own commanders had abandoned her to the death of the 100 million, the Americans were providing 3 meals a day and medical screenings for tuberculosis and malaria. This historical evidence serves as a profound indictment of the propaganda that had fueled the war. The barbarians from across the sea were, in fact, governed by a set of rules, the Geneva Convention, that the Japanese students had never even heard of. In the camps, the nurses observed a strange and confusing sight: American officers being held accountable for their treatment of prisoners. They saw a chain of command that prioritized the stability of the civilian population to ensure a peaceful occupation. This wasn't merely a tactical choice. It was the manifestation of a democratic ideology that viewed individuals not as disposable fuel for a state engine, but as lives possessing inherent value. The shift in the nurses' perception was recorded in their later testimonies. They described the demons as men who wept when they saw the condition of the Okinawan children, and who gave up their own sleeping bags to ensure the sick had a dry place to rest. The evidence of this humanity was everywhere. In the abundance of the field hospitals, the organized distribution of clothing, and the absence of the cleansing executions they had been promised. The data of the Okinawan campaign is often measured in tons of steel and numbers of dead, but for the Himeyuri who lived, the most significant evidence was the survival of their own dignity in the hands of a supposed enemy. Their transition from terrified fugitives to protected civilians was a victory of truth over a decade of manufactured hatred. The realization that their entire moral universe was built upon a foundation of falsehoods was more agonizing than the wounds they had treated. For years, the Himeyuri nurses had been told that the highest expression of their humanity was to discard it for the state, to choose the cold finality of the grenade over the perceived filth of the enemy's touch. They had believed that honor was a fixed point, a destination reached only through a spectacular, self-inflicted death. But as they looked around the American camps, that ideology began to rot like the abandoned fortifications on the Shuri line. The honor they had been promised was a hollow shell, a manipulative tool used by a desperate leadership to turn schoolgirls into martyrs. True honor, they now saw, was not found in the cessation of life, but in the stubborn, difficult preservation of it. The American respect for their lives was not a weakness, as the Japanese officers had claimed, but a terrifying strength. It was the strength of a society that did not need to kill its captives to prove its superiority. The nurses watched as American GIs, men who had just come from the carnage of Sugarloaf Hill, spent their resting hours carving small wooden toys for Okinawan children or sharing their precious tobacco with elderly survivors. This was a radical subversion of the Bushido code. The demons possessed a capacity for empathy that made the rigid, unforgiving honor of the imperial army seem primitive and brittle. The girls began to understand that they had been prepared to die for a version of Japan that viewed them as expendable, while the monsters they feared were treating them as irreplaceable. This breaking of ideology was a slow, painful awakening. It involved mourning not just their fallen classmates, but the very identity they had worn since childhood. They realized that the death of the 100 million was a nihilistic fantasy, a way for a failed regime to hide its own incompetence behind a veil of collective suicide. The Americans, with their endless crates of rations and their specialized medical teams, offered a different path, a future where a person's value was not measured by their willingness to die, but by their ability to rebuild. The weight of the ceramic grenades, which some had kept as a habit of fear, was finally discarded into the red Okinawan mud. They were no longer the Himeyuri of the emperor's propaganda. They were survivors of a tragedy that had been unnecessary from the start. The transition was signaled by the absence of the bonsai spirit. In its place was a quiet, industrious focus on the living. The nurses stopped looking at the ground when the Americans passed. They looked them in the eye, searching for the shared humanity that had been suppressed by years of indoctrination. They saw that the American abundance, the chocolate, the medicine, the steel, was a byproduct of a system that allowed for individual choice and mercy. The realization was profound. They had been saved not by a superior weapon, but by a superior idea. The ideology of death had been defeated by the simple, persistent reality of life, and for the first time in their young lives, the nurses felt the heavy burden of honor lift, replaced by the terrifying and beautiful responsibility of freedom. The final chapter of the Himeyuri legacy is not written in the soot of the caves, but in the enduring light of the peace that followed. As the guns of Okinawa fell silent and the smoke cleared from the shattered ridges, the nurses who emerged from the American field hospitals carried with them a truth that no propaganda could ever erase. They had entered the war as children of a closed, militaristic society, bound by a code that demanded their destruction as the price of their devotion. They left as witnesses to a different kind of power, one that found its greatest expression not in the typhoon of steel, but in the simple, quiet distribution of a chocolate bar to a starving enemy. The symbolic weight of that Hershey's bar, once a source of terror and suspicion, became the cornerstone of their new reality. It represented a world of democratic abundance where the individual was not a tool of the state, but a life worthy of protection and sweetness. In the decades that followed, the survivors of the Himeyuri Student Corps became the primary narrators of this transformation. They did not speak of the glorious death they had been promised. They spoke of the terrifying beauty of being saved. Their stories serve as a poetic reflection on the nature of ideology and the persistent strength of human decency. The Battle of Okinawa remains a scar on the history of the Pacific, a testament to the heights of human cruelty, yet within that darkness, the treatment of the nurses stands as a beacon of a larger truth. It proved that even in the most brutal of conflicts, the cycle of hatred can be broken by a single act of unmerited kindness. The American soldiers who shared their water and their medicine were not just conquerors. They were the architects of a reconciliation that would redefine the relationship between two nations for generations. The Himeyuri Peace Museum stands today as a silent sentinel over the grounds where the girls once hid, but its message is one of life, not of the grave. It honors the memory of those who perished while celebrating the resilience of those who were given a second chance by the very demons they had been taught to loathe. This historical cinematic journey concludes with the realization that freedom is often found in the most unlikely of places, in the hands of a stranger, in the taste of a foreign confection, and in the courage to accept mercy when one has been prepared for execution. The nurses of Okinawa learned that the greatest victory is not the defeat of an enemy, but the discovery of a brother in the wreckage of war. Their legacy is a reminder that while empires may fall and ideologies may crumble, the simple, profound act of treating another human being with honor is the only foundation upon which a lasting peace can ever be built.